Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Marquette University Law School, the Lubar Center. I'm Mike Gousha, and today we're releasing the latest national survey of public opinion toward the U.S. Supreme Court. To walk us through the findings is the poll's director, Professor Charles Franklin. And Charles, always good to be with you. Let's begin by talking about the methodology for this poll, when we were in the field, the number of folks we talked to.
Yeah, so this is a national sample of adults. We interviewed 1,004 people from November 1st through the 10th, and it has a margin of error of plus or minus 3.9 percentage points. We're using the modern approach to online sampling, where we sample postal delivery addresses across the country so that we know exactly the probability of each address being sampled. And then we send a letter to those folks and invite them to take part in a set of surveys, not just the Marquette poll. But then they are sent an individualized invitation to take our poll. They can only take it if they have that individualized code, and they can only take it once. So no double dipping on the poll, no matter how much fun it is. And so this is a way of having the advantages of online polling with the same kind of high-quality random sample of homes that we used to do when we did face-to-face interviews back in the 50s and 60s, and the same kind of probability-based sampling that we do with telephone. And this is different from some online surveys that still use purely volunteer samples, people that they invite to participate through a variety of advertising and other things. And then they try to weight those data to match the population, but it's fundamentally not a random sample to begin with. And so there's some controversy about these different methods, but we believe the methods that we're using and our polling partner, SSRS, a large polling firm in Pennsylvania that actually conducts the polls for us, that this is really the state of the art in web-based interviews that are tied to these addresses where people live.
And we should point out, though, that this is different than what we do for our statewide polling here at Marquette.
And in the statewide polls, we're using a random probability sample of telephone numbers in Wisconsin, and we're doing live telephone interviews with a human interviewer for the Wisconsin polls. So two different methodologies, but the key is they're both based on a random sample of the public, not just volunteers who happen to come to a website and decide to take a poll one or more times.
Sure. So how many people participated in this survey?
We had 1,004. That's a margin of error of plus or minus 3.9%. And that 1,004 are all adults, 18 and over, not necessarily registered voters. That's another difference from the Wisconsin surveys where we interview registered voters. But the questions we ask in these national surveys are about a broad range of public policy issues and about the U.S. Supreme Court. And everybody's entitled to have opinions about those things, whether you're a registered voter or not. Whereas surveys that are focused much more on elections, like our Wisconsin work, naturally we'd like to talk more to people who are registered to vote.
Well, this poll is the latest in a series of polls we've done on the Supreme Court. Explain the project that we've undertaken here, Charles.
Well, we started in 2019 doing these national surveys. The Supreme Court has, of course, become more central to our political debates in recent years. That's a process that's been going on for a long time, but even more so in recent years. So I think one point is that we want to understand how the public views the court, how they understand the things that the court does, what they agree with and what they disagree with. And, you know, as a law school, it seems reasonable for us to be interested in the U.S. Supreme Court. But along with that, we also ask some questions about current national political issues as well, because, you know, it may not be court-related, but it's part of the broader public opinion atmosphere that we're living in. After doing 2019 and 22 annual surveys on the court, this year we've shifted gears and we're now doing surveys every other month. So we're going to watch the opinion about the court throughout its term, and that means that some months like this one, the survey will fall just as the court is hearing some important cases. Other months will be in the field shortly after the court's rendered a decision, and finally, when we get to the end of the court's term, we'll be doing a July survey to look back and see what people think about the term that the court will then have completed.
Well, we're going to begin today's conversation by talking about the issue of abortion, because that issue, Charles, really is front and center for the court at this moment in time.
It is, and even more so than we initially expected. The fate of Roe versus Wade and the right to an abortion that it established, of course, has been controversial for the nearly 50 years since Roe was handed down in 1973. But we knew that the court had accepted a case from Mississippi limiting abortions to 15 weeks of pregnancy. But what we didn't expect, or at least I didn't when we started this project, was that the Texas SB 8, Senate Bill 8 bill, would be passed and then litigated. This is the Texas law that limits abortions after just 6 weeks of pregnancy after cardiac activity can be detected. But it also has this unusual enforcement mechanism that officials of the state of Texas are prohibited from enforcing the law, but it gives authority to individual people to bring lawsuits against anyone who aids in an abortion. So that case was initially considered by the court in the very early fall, when the court decided not to issue a ruling in it, went back to the lower courts, and has come back to the Supreme Court. We'll talk about that in more detail. The point of all of this is that between the long-standing question about what to do with Roe versus Wade, the Mississippi 15-week ban, and now the Texas 6-week ban with this unusual legal situation, we really have found ourselves in just the span of this month, really, considering a lot of important issues concerning abortion. So as a result, this is the advantage of doing the polling as frequently as we are. We've been able to adapt the survey to include items on each of these topics, and we'll tell you about them in a minute.
Well, why don't we begin with the Texas law, the law that you just described here, Charles. How do people feel about that law? Do they favor it? Do they oppose it? How do they feel about it?
Yeah, there's a pretty lopsided view of opinion when we just ask, here's a description of the law, which I've already just given you. Do you favor this law or do you oppose it? 25% said they favored the law, but 59% opposed it, and 16% say they don't have an opinion about it. So this is a pretty lopsided view of opposing the law on the substance of the law, both in terms of the 6-week ban and the enforcement mechanism.
And let's talk about ideology and the role it plays in the numbers you just talked about.
Yeah, I don't think you'll be surprised that we'll find ideology plays a pretty sharp dividing line throughout all of these questions that we asked. In this case, among the very conservative respondents, people who label themselves very conservative, 73% favor the Texas law, just 14% oppose it. But at the opposite end, among very liberals, it's 3% favor and 90% oppose. And in both of these cases, relatively few people don't have an opinion about it. 13% of the very conservative, but just 6% of very liberal people lack an opinion. And if you look towards the middle of the spectrum, among pure moderates, 20% support and 64% oppose. And then it's a little more support among people who are just somewhat conservative and a little less among those who are somewhat liberal.
The party ID, do we see the same number, or is it a little weaker than what we just
normally
described?
we, of course, expect to see pretty big party differences on a lot of things. But partisanship has a pretty sharp difference, but it's not as sharp as it is along ideological lines. 50% of Republicans favor it, 33% oppose, and among Democrats it's 10 to 76. So those margins are pretty lopsided, but they're not as lopsided as we saw with ideology. And I do think this is maybe a particular set of issues on abortion where ideological orientation is actually a bit more powerful in predicting abortion attitudes, whereas within the parties, while the parties are pretty lopsided, they're not as lopsided as what we see by ideological self-identification.
Let's look at this through the eyes of religious groups. How do people in various religious groups view this legislation in Texas, this law in Texas?
And here what we see is those who describe themselves as born-again Christians are quite positive to the law, 48% in favor, 28% opposed. But among all of the other religious groups we're able to break out, so that's other Protestants, Roman Catholics, those without a religious affiliation, and those with some other religious affiliation, solid majorities of all of those other groups oppose the Texas SB 8 law. It's only among the born-again Christians who a majority support the law.
Let's contrast that, Charles, with the support for overturning Roe versus Wade, the 1973 law that legalized abortion in this country. How does the Texas law stand up next to public opinion for Roe versus Wade?
There is support for maintaining Roe. We asked the question, would you favor the court overruling Roe, or would you oppose the court overruling Roe? 21% favor overturning the Roe decision, but 47%, more than twice as many, are opposed to doing away with Roe. But I think it's interesting that 32% say they either haven't heard anything about Roe or haven't heard enough to have an opinion about it. And especially for those of us who have had Roe in our consciousness for the nearly 50 years since it was enacted or handed down, it's really quite striking that this many people say that. Now, I want to say that lots of polling doesn't show that many who say they don't know, because they don't actually offer don't know as an option. It's routine in surveys to say, do you favor or oppose? And if a respondent on the telephone says, oh, I don't have an opinion about that, you take that and you move on. But that's always a smaller number than if you invite people to say they haven't thought about it. In our polling on the court and its issues, we recognize that for an awful lot of the public, they don't get up first thing in the morning and think about the U.S. Supreme Court. So we explicitly offer in the questions, or haven't you thought much about this? Or haven't you thought enough to have an opinion? And so that's one reason we have the large don't know percentage. But I think you'll see that it's a revealing number for what it tells us about how much people think about this issue and how much they attend to questions about it.
And I think you hit it on the head. For people of a certain age, as we shall say, Roe versus Wade has been something that has been there for a long time, and we're certainly very aware of it. But for younger people, and I was actually kind of surprised when I saw this in the poll, Charles, younger folks, the awareness of Roe versus Wade, not as great, not nearly as great.
Not nearly as great. And I didn't really expect to see that, but I thought it was really striking. Among people 60 and over, only 16% lack an opinion about Roe. But when we look at 18 to 29-year-olds, it's 43% that say they haven't heard enough about it to have an opinion. And it's almost as high, 39 and 36, among those in the 30 to 44 and 45 to 59 categories. So I really think it's maybe not a coincidence that this law or this ruling that was handed down in 1973, not quite 50 years ago, is really prominent in the thinking of people that were at least nearly 10 years old at the time it was handed down and sort of grew up with the controversies about Roe in the 70s and 80s at least. Whereas the folks that are much younger than 60, Roe may have been always there in the background, but it wasn't the hot issues during their young adult lives that it is for those who are now 60 or so. And so it's, at least from a social science point of view, pretty interesting that this sharp gradient in attention to the issue shows up on the issue of Roe by age the way it does.
Are younger voters more aware, for example, of the Texas law than they are of Roe?
That's the other really interesting thing. So you might say that we get a high percentage that don't know about Roe just because the way we ask the question. But on the Texas SB 8, it's half as many that say don't know. It's only 16% that say they don't have an opinion about the SB 8. And by age, there is no gradient whatsoever across age. 18 to 29-year-olds and 60 plus are equally likely to have an opinion about it. One exception is the 45 to 59-year-olds who are a little bit higher in not having an opinion. But it's nothing like the gap that we see with Roe. So I think what's different? Well, SB 8 is a hot, current, contemporary issue. And while, 16% haven't heard enough about it, most people have. Whereas Roe, even though it may be mentioned in the same story or commentary along with SB 8, nevertheless, it's not the central element in the same way that SB 8 is right now. Now, the court's going to be hearing arguments that explicitly challenge Roe, and will hand down a decision sometime over the coming months. It's certainly possible that everyone will hear a great deal about Roe in the coming months, and we'll be following that too. I want to see whether more consideration, more coverage in a court decision, one way or the other, makes any difference in how many people are aware of the issues in Roe, and especially among young people, whether they pick up more information.
Let's go a little bit further inside the Roe v. Wade numbers, Charles, and talk about ideology and the role it plays in terms of people's views of that decision.
Well, as we saw with the SB 8 law, there's pretty sharp ideological differences. Among very conservatives, 61% would like to overturn Roe, just 9% would keep Roe as it is. And, basically more than the reverse among very liberal people, 7% would see it overturned and 84% don't want it overturned. The balance among moderates is 13 for overturn and 49 for keep it as it is. So, with the exception of conservatives, either very or somewhat conservative, where pluralities would favor overturning it, moderates and the two categories of liberals are quite strong in their support of keeping Roe as the law.
And party differences, are they similar to what we found with the Texas law?
Pretty much so, and again, a bit muted. Republicans favor overturning, but only by a 37 to 24 margin with a substantial don't know. Democrats more united in keeping it, 8 to 65 in favor of keeping it.
And how do the various religious groups we asked about earlier, Charles, how do they view the possibility of overturning Roe versus Wade?
Here, it's only the born-again Christians, the self-described born-again Christians, who have a plurality, 39 in favor of overturning, 25 opposed, but 25 in that group, and a 36% who say they don't have an opinion. And again, if we think of the last 50 years, you would think evangelical organizations have been very active in the pro-life movement. You would think this is more salient. But again, I did not look at this as by age within religious group, but it would be very interesting to see, again, if this is a message that still resonates with older voters, but really is not central to the thinking of younger voters, no matter whether they favor or oppose Roe. They just may not pay as much attention to it.
One of the things that we've seen in America in polling about the issue of abortion is that there as generally as we found even in our polling, that there tends to be support for Roe v. Wade, but at certain points during a pregnancy, there is less support for abortion. And so let's talk about the other case that's before the court. This is the Mississippi case. So it's not 6 weeks, it's 15 weeks. So it's more restrictive. How do people feel about that as an option?
And this is a great example that when you listen to the folks who are intensely involved with the abortion issue, either for abortion or against abortion, pro-life or pro-choice, the passion that they bring to these issues would make you think that this is an absolute issue. But what we see in survey questions, really going all the way back to the 1970s, is that the particular circumstances surrounding an abortion play a lot in whether people think that should or should not be legal or what those circumstances are. So while we see a clear plurality, a clear substantial majority of those who have an opinion on keeping abortion legal, there is a willingness to set limits on those abortions. And in particular, when we ask about a 15-week ban, we get 37% in favor of upholding that Mississippi law, 32% would like to see the law struck down, and again, 30% who say they haven't heard enough. So it's a small plurality that would uphold the 15-week ban. In other polling, we've seen support for things like 20-week bans that were popular in legislatures a few years ago. And it's fair to also say that I expect a lot of respondents aren't aware of when viability is considered to have occurred, usually around 24 weeks, and that current legal thinking has limited the ability of states to enact restrictions on abortion pre-viability. The Mississippi law is explicitly challenging that doctrine and hoping to get the court to agree that it can be regulated by the state prior to that usual 24-week of viability.
And let's talk about the ideological and party differences on this particular law.
Yeah, this one has a sharp divide. Very conservatives, 80% want to see the law upheld. Just 5% would like to see it struck down. Among very liberals, it's 17 would see it upheld, a little bit higher than the opposite. But 65% of very liberals would like it struck down. However, moderates split evenly, 32 to 32 on this, whereas they split pretty lopsidedly in favor of not overruling Roe in the earlier question.
So let's go back to the Texas law for a moment, Charles, because there is something else before the court, and this is whether or not the federal government should be allowed to go to court to prohibit the Texas law from taking effect. We asked about that. It's kind of a separate issue from the earlier discussion we were having, but it's an important issue in front of the court.
And this case, or it's actually a pair of cases before the court, are much more concerning issues of procedure and standing and who do you enjoin if you do. So it doesn't address directly the policy question involved in the Texas law. That's why we asked a separate question about the substance of the law. But since the court heard this Texas pair of cases on November 1st, the first day the day we began interviewing that evening, we thought it was appropriate to see, and also it is in this case, the federal government's attempt to be allowed to continue its case to try to sue Texas to stop the law. 38% favored the federal government being allowed to sue Texas. 30% opposed allowing the federal government to do that. And again, 31% said they hadn't heard enough about it.
You're going to say something else?
Well, I was just going to go ahead and say that people actually line up their opinions on this case pretty well with how they feel on the substance of the Texas law. Of those that favor the Texas law, 18% would like the federal government to be allowed to sue Texas, but 51% want the court not to allow that suit. But of those who oppose the Texas law, 54% want the government to be allowed to follow the suit, and 24% want it not to be. So there's a pretty good alignment between what your preference is on the substance of the law and what your preference is on this rather technical procedural case that the court has just heard.
There's an important Second Amendment case before the court, and this involves the right to carry a gun outside of the home. Tell us a little bit about the case and what we're looking at here.
This is a New York case coming from New York. New York has a concealed carry permit law, but it requires applicants to demonstrate a heightened fear or concern for their safety to be allowed to be permitted to carry a concealed weapon outside the home. And I think it, in the argument of the case, was acknowledged that New York's statute is one of the more restrictive statutes. So the plaintiffs in the case were denied a concealed carry permit. Their suit is aimed, in part at least, to see if the court is willing to rule that the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms extends to a right to carry out a concealed weapon or a weapon outside the home, and that these permitting statutes must fail if they're preventing people from being able to exercise that right. The last time the court ruled on gun rights, which is now more than a decade ago, they ruled that you had a right to a weapon for self-protection within your home, but they didn't address this question of carrying it outside the home. So this is the case that gun rights advocates have looked to as the case that could extend that right to cover concealed carry outside the home and affect licensing requirements in those states that have relatively restrictive licensing requirements. And so, or all states, really, but many states have adopted more permissive concealed carry laws in recent years, but there's still a substantial number of states that have these restrictive laws.
So the question we asked was for the New York State case.
Yeah. Should the court rule that there is a Second Amendment right to carry a gun outside the home? And what we found was that 46% say they would favor a ruling that establishes that as a right under the Second Amendment. 25% are opposed, and 27% say they haven't heard enough. And that's not much change from in September when we asked the same question. So this is an example of the growth in support for concealed carry that we've seen in policy surveys in Wisconsin, but also around the country, that as concealed carry has become much more common across the country, support for it as a policy has also grown. Here we see 47 to 25 plurality that would favor extending that as a part of the Second Amendment.
And one might assume there would be more support for the ability to carry that gun outside the home amongst those who have a gun in the household.
Yeah, and there's no surprise in that. But also those gun households are much more aware of the case than the non-gun households. In gun households, 61% favor establishing a carry right, 17 are opposed, and 18 don't have an opinion. But among non-gun households, it's about an even split, 35 in favor, 31 opposed, but 33 that don't have an opinion about it.
We're going to talk about the approval of the court, Charles. This is a question we've been asking now for a few polls. How did the court fare this time around?
It's up just a little bit. 54% approve. That's up from 49% that approved 2 months ago in September. Disapproval also declined a shade to 46%, down from 50%. But a little over a year ago, in September 2020, it was at 66 approval, 33 disapproval. So we saw not much change from September 2020 to our July 21 survey, but then a sharp decline in September and a little bit of a rise back, but it's only a little bit of a rise back here in November. The September survey was shortly after the court failed to act in the Texas SB 8 case and got a tremendous amount of attention when they did that.
Let's talk about approval by party. And I think this, sometimes depends on, the moment in time we're in, if depending on who the president is, which party that president's with. I mean, I think there is an association, clearly.
We certainly see that over these years that we've been doing the survey now, that with a Republican president, Republicans are a little more positive to the court. With a Democratic president, even though the court's composition may not have changed, Democrats have been a little more positive. However, that has shifted now. Way back in 2020, 80% of Republicans approved of the court with a Republican president. But that fell to 57% in July, and it's come back up slightly to 61% among Republicans in September and now in November. It really hadn't changed. Independents dropped off a bit from 64 more than a year ago, and they're down at about 53 now and fell in the fall, but not by a whole lot. It's Democrats, though, that moved more. They were at 57% approval of the court in September of 2020, and actually just a shade higher in July of this year at 59, but fell sharply in September to 37%, but now have come back up a little bit to 49%. So I think if you think about it since July, Republicans haven't moved much, independents haven't moved much, but Democrats moved down pretty sharply and now have come up a little bit, but are still well below the level of Democratic approval that we saw over a year ago.
Yeah, there has been movement in that last year, definitely in how people view the court. But still, Charles, they tend to trust this branch of government more than the others.
Yeah, it's striking that we ask a question, of the Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court, who do you trust the most? And in this survey, 60% say they trust the court the most, 23 the presidency, 16 the Congress. But those numbers have really only barely moved since our first survey in 2019. If you dig down into the numbers, what you find is that if your party is controlling the presidency, your trust in the presidency goes up a lot, and your trust in the court kind of goes down some, and almost nobody moves into liking the Congress much more. But when the other party takes the presidency, your trust in the presidency just plummets. And that happened with Democrats when Trump was president. Now it's happened with Republicans and Biden as president. But the ramification is that as they don't trust a president anymore, they raise their level of trust in the court. So it's not the same group of people that are always trusting the court, but it's driven very much by which of these institutions does my party control. And if I'm out of control, especially of the presidency, then I look to the court as a more trustworthy branch.
One of the things that we have seen in recent months, Charles, is justices in public settings trying to drive home the point that they are not partisans. But the question is, do people see them as not being partisan? What did we find in this poll?
Yeah, in this case, we've seen both one of the liberal members of the court and 3 of the conservative members give speeches or public interviews in which they argue pretty strongly that our decisions are based on the law and we have differences in judicial philosophy, but it's not party. So since 2019, we've been asking the question, do you think that the justices' decisions are mainly based on politics or mainly based on the law? Well, it turns out that a solid majority in this latest poll, 70%, say mainly the law. Just 30% say mainly politics. And that hadn't changed much back in 2019. It was 64% mainly the law, 34% politics. And even in September, when job approval of the court went down, we still had 61% saying mainly the law and 39% mainly politics. So it is clear that while the court has its critics and critics across issues with disagreement on the court on issues, it's sort of striking that over these more than 2 years of pretty contentious politics about the court, that confidence still remains that decisions are mostly based on the law. Seeing that start to erode would be a very big concern institutionally, and I think certainly hearing the justices speak about it suggests that they are concerned about this perception. But in our data, at least, if not in the op-ed columns, which have a stronger view of these things, really by more than 2 to 1, the public is still pretty confident that the judges are mostly guided by the law.
Is that across the board, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or independent, or are there noticeable differences there?
There are some differences, but it's sort of striking that solid majorities of at least 2/3 of each party group say the justices decide mainly on the law. What we do see is that those folks that are disapproving of the court are split about evenly in saying it's law or politics, while those who are approving of the court overwhelmingly say it's based on the law. And so this is, the area in which growing distrust or disapproval of the court could erode this element that judges may differ in legal philosophy, but they are applying legal reasoning in their decisions.
We have a few questions in this poll about potential court reforms. We've been asking about this now for several polls. And actually, Charles, there is a presidential commission on the Supreme Court discussing some of these issues. But I guess the big question is, does the American public have much knowledge of this commission and the work that they're doing?
And that commission report is supposed to be released this month. Draft elements of it were released a month or two ago. But the public, maybe not surprisingly, is really not glued to their TV sets following this. 45% said they've heard nothing at all about the commission. Another 42% say they've heard only a little bit. 10% have heard a fair bit, and just 2% say they've heard a lot. In the early days of the Biden administration and the Democratic control of Congress, much was talked about changing the structure of the court. And I think in part this presidential commission was appointed to sort of shape the discussion around that. When they release their report, we'll see what their decisions are, what their arguments are from the commission. But until they do that, we're clearly not in a situation where much of the public has paid attention. It's really those who are close watchers of the court who've watched this and actually rather enjoyed reading some of their historical documents about the court.
Let's talk a little bit about those potential reforms. One that we have heard a fair amount, people following this discussion. Wonder about the size of the court, and there's talk about whether it should be expanded. Maybe that would represent a larger America today than what the Founding Fathers had in mind. Or should we just leave it the same as it's always been? Or not always been, but the same as it's mostly been.
Since shortly after the Civil War, anyway.
Exactly.
Here is pretty evenly divided. 48% would expand the court, 52% oppose expanding the court. But in 2019, that was 42-56. So there really hadn't been much of a trend in this opinion. There are differences by party and opinion on this, with Democrats more willing to expand the court. But of the reforms we looked at, that's the one that comes closest to a majority and is basically an even split.
What about the idea of justices having lifetime appointments? There's talk again that they should be limited in terms of the length of term.
Right. And there's large levels of support for that. In this latest poll, 72% support those limits, 27 oppose. That's been over 70% each time we've asked this going back several years. It's not easy to do, though, because the Constitution mentions life appointment for a term of good behavior, so it would be a complicated thing to change it. But of the proposals, it's the one that gets the most support. Maybe that's partly to do with the broader support for term limits, or at least not life tenure in a variety of positions. Maybe some of it is particular to the judges or the justices, but would be very complicated to undo if it were to proceed to limit terms.
What about the idea of limiting judicial review of acts of Congress, Charles?
Yeah, yet another thing, and one that comes up in past eras of talking about court reform is, well, let's limit the court's ability to rule in certain areas or to overturn acts of Congress. We asked about the court's ability to overturn acts of Congress. 56% oppose that, 43% favor it. And so a smaller majority opposed than what we saw in favor of term limits, but still a clear majority, unlike in the case of expanding the court, which was pretty close to an even toss-up. So across these three issues, over time, we've always seen a majority opposed to limiting the court's jurisdiction. We've always seen a bigger majority in favor of term limits. Excuse me. And we've almost always seen a close split on expanding the court, with slightly more opposed to expansion than in favor.
None of these things easy to do, though, or accomplish. That's the other
That's
part
another
of this
small
equation.
problem in all of this, which besets us in all kinds of avenues of government these days.
So let's go back to your takeaways from this latest survey of attitudes toward the Supreme Court, Charles. The abortion issue is really, I think, I said front and center earlier, but I think that's really where we are right now, at least where the court is at this moment in time.
Certainly in this November sitting, where the justices heard the Texas arguments, again, about the procedural cases, they're going to hear the Mississippi case on December 1st. And within that argument is the challenge to Roe, as well as the elements particular to the Mississippi case. I think if I have a takeaway, and it's a fairly big one, it is that the folks that talk about abortion and are most involved in it rarely seem to appreciate the nuances of how we feel about this issue. One part of that was the high percent without opinions and the fact that that has this sharp age difference on Roe itself. But with that, a solid plurality by 2-1 that want to see abortion remain legal, but at the same time, for the same respondents in the same interview, are willing to allow more restrictions on abortion. And depending on how the court rules, we could move into a period of where do those restrictions lie? Is Roe in fact overturned? Or do the justices find some middle ground on this? And so I really do think that this is a long-standing issue, but where new developments are taking place during this sitting of the Supreme Court. And by the end of the term, at the end of June, the 1st of July, we'll have some answers on this one way or another, and we'll see how the public reacts to that when these issues are being decided by the court with real consequence, no matter how they're settled.
Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law School Poll. Pleasure being with you today. Thanks for telling us about the latest results of the Supreme Court survey, and we will also be looking at the latest results of a national survey that will look at some of our elected officials and also some of the issues facing America. We'll have that out yet this week. We'll see you next time here on The Issues.